We're going to be talking about the Great Reset again on this segment of Stopping Socialism TV. We have some very important updates, some kind of dire updates on the Great Reset, so you're going to want to stay tuned for this one.
We're in trouble, America.
That's right.
We're screwed.
For a number of reasons.
We're screwed. It's all over.
But to get this important message out there, I have to start off every episode like this. We need your help. You need to like this video. You need to share this video. Leave a comment. These are the easy things that you can do to get this message out there. Otherwise, Facebook, Google, YouTube, they will make sure that nobody beyond you sees this video. So do that. It's the easiest thing you could do. It's the most helpful thing you can do to help us get this message out there. Justin, the Great Reset, I would hope that our audience knows by now what the Great Reset is. But I don't know if you want to do a real brief recap on the basics there before jumping into what our big update is on this.
Yeah, so I mean, just a real quick Great Reset initiative, the official initiative launched in June 2020, so 2020, last year. And the idea behind the Great Reset is they want to push the reset button on the entire global economic system. And by they, I mean essentially the entire ruling class of the world. I mean, we're talking about the heads of major corporations. We're talking the heads of banks, central banks, international institutions, United Nations, International Monetary Fund, labor unions, activist groups. All these people gathered together working in conjunction with the World Economic Forum. Those are the Davos people, the people that hold that big conference in Davos, Switzerland every year, to push the reset button on capitalism through two big overarching plans. The first one is a gigantic expansion of government through things like the Green New Deal and the European Green New Deal. They're I don't even know if they call it the Green New Deal. It's like the European Green Deal or something like that, but they've got their own version of it over there. And federal jobs guarantee, all single-payer healthcare, all of that stuff. Big increases in taxes for corporations and for wealthy individuals. All your standard big left-wing Bernie Sanders type programs. And then in addition to that, the second big part of the Great Reset is ESG standards. We've done a whole bunch of things on ESG standards. So if you're interested in learning on about the details of that, you'll get some of that in this video, but go back and watch some of our other videos about ESG standards to learn what they are. But essentially, it's a new way to evaluate businesses so that instead of looking at just profits and instead of looking at the quality of goods and services, you look at those things plus a whole bunch of social justice goals on top of it. So it's a way to kind of force the business, the entire economy really to move, not just move leftward, but promote leftism and leftist ideas and sort of impose it on on societies, even if they don't necessarily want those things. So things like your carbon footprint, things like your ratio of one racial group to another racial group within your company, a whole host of other things, how woke you are, essentially.
Yeah,
it's a scoring system for wokeness.
Right. Companies being judged based on their environment scores, their social justice scores, that type of stuff, being judged on that instead of just how good of the products or services that you provide. You know,
exactly.
That's the new thing. But you said the word force, right? So this is one of the things that we've kind of grappled with ever since we discovered this whole Great Reset movement, is that the way that it's been talked about, the way that even the businesses that are involved in this talk about it, it's a voluntary thing, right? These companies voluntarily choose to, put themselves into this ESG system where they're ranked based on these different metrics. But this new update kind of moves from voluntary interactions into force. So what is this big update here?
Right. So in the past, as you just alluded to, ESG scores, and there's about 80% of all large companies in the United States have an ESG scoring system that they voluntarily adopted. And they've been big companies, big corporations all over the world have been adopting and implementing ESG scores throughout their entire businesses for several years now. And it's been called sustainable investment. It's been called all sorts of different things, but this ESG system has become very popular within corporate America and the international corporate community, especially in the West. And for a long time, we've thought, why is this happening? When we started investigating this over a year ago, why are they doing this? Why is this happening? And there's always been, a couple different reasons for why this has been occurring. But one of the main things is there's always been this it's not even like an explicit statement, but there's always been these allusions throughout writings and speeches and interviews and things with corporate leaders and with investors and other people, sort of alluding to this idea that someday, not maybe, but someday, this is going to be imposed on them. They're not going to have a choice. But up until relatively recently, up until right now, really, there's been no explicit mandate for ESG scores. It's just been something that's been voluntarily adopted by these companies because we think there's all sorts of cronyism involved, but also because they expect this mandate to come. Well, sure. This new update is that we think the mandate has come. We think that the mandate is finally on the verge of actually being imposed on these businesses. And so this is what they've been anticipating. This is what they've been expecting. This is why they've been putting these ESG systems in place. We think this is a big part of it. And the news is in March of this year, 2021, the European Parliament, which is the legislative body within the European Union, adopted a resolution that called for their version of ESG scores in Europe. And what they want to do is make these ESG scores in Europe, within the European Union, for all large businesses, publicly traded businesses, and some smaller businesses in certain industries, mandatory. You have to have it. And it would be enforced, it would be imposed by national governments across the EU if the EU actually approves this. The Parliament already approved it. But the way the European Union works, in order for it to actually become an approved mandate from the European Union, it has to first be proposed by something called the European Commission, which is sort of the executive body of the European Union. And then it has to be approved again by Parliament. Parliament's already approved it, so we think that's very likely to happen. The European Commission usually goes along with what the European Parliament wants, so it's highly likely that this thing is going to happen. It's going to be approved because it received overwhelming support within the European Parliament. And there are people saying that they expect this legislation to be formally introduced by the Commission in, I think, as early as June of this year. And the expectation is that it's going to be approved and actually go into force sometime later in the year. So what it would do is it would impose an ESG mandate on all of these companies that I referenced earlier in the European Union, but not just them. It would also impose it on everyone who's in their value chain. Value chain is their language for supply chain. So that means every business that does business with these European Union companies that would be under this mandate would also have to either have ESG scores or agree to abide by the ESG mandates or the goals of the ESG system, depending on what you're talking about. So in other words, is your company environmentally friendly? Is it using green energy? Okay, environmentally friendly from their perspective. Is it using wind and solar for its energy? If it doesn't have an ESG system that sort of embraces green energy, do you have some kind of contract with this business that may exist outside of the European Union? Do you have a contract with them so that when they're interacting with you, they're going to use green energy in that part of the supply chain? This is the kind of thing that's in the resolution that was passed by the European Parliament, and it's the expectation that this is going to become mandatory over the course of this next year. So this isn't, the important thing to take away from this is it's not just a European Union thing. This would impact every business that does business with the European Union, which is the vast majority of businesses here in the United States, large corporations here in the United States. They would also be affected by this. So this is a way to not only make ESG scores mandatory in a major part of the world and one of the largest parts of the global economy, but also to kind of force everyone outside of the European Union that does business in the European Union to go along with it. And that means that, in effect, the European Union's ESG system, whatever they decide to, make a priority within their ESG system, would be imposed on us as Americans as well, on our companies. Because if our companies want to do business with them, they have to go along with it. And if they have to go along with it, then we're going to be, as consumers here in the United States, forced to sort of deal with it as well. So if you get some company, some bank or financial institution or Coca-Cola or something like that, and there's an ESG system in place in Europe that says you have to, rely on wind and solar, only drive electric cars or whatever, then they're going to impose that on their operations most likely across the board. It's highly likely that whatever they put into place in Europe is going to impact us here in the United States. And there's really no reason to believe they're going to fight this here in the United States, because so many people in government right now, like Joe Biden, John Kerry, many people within the Biden administration and in Congress support this kind of thing anyway. So they're likely to go along with it and not push back against it. So this is a huge, huge moment for the Great Reset. Yeah. It's actually putting the Great Reset into law in a way that has not happened yet.
Yeah, when we were first talking about this, basically up until this announcement, we always kind of, and you kind of mentioned this earlier, like we were wondering exactly why these companies would go along with it. Yeah, there's the idea that, maybe down the road, something like this could happen. There could be a law requiring it. So let's just kind of get ahead of the game. But it was also like a carrot on a stick approach, where it's like we always kind of speculated that as more bailouts and, different stimulus became more mainstream, brought very mainstream because of all the COVID stuff. Once that happens more and more, becomes more frequent, that it would be, they would designate, different companies to be more likely to get these handouts from the government if you had a higher ESG score. So it was almost like a carrot on a stick approach. That's kind of what we were speculating to be the case. This is the opposite, right? Instead of being rewarded for being a good ESG person, you're being punished, right? That's what this law is. You're being punished if you don't go along with the system. So what is the punishment? Is it a slap on the wrist? Do you not be able to be a company anymore? How does it actually work in Europe?
Well, my understanding is, and again, this hasn't gone into force yet, but the understanding is that there's going to be financial penalties for businesses that don't go along with this. And those are going to be imposed by the national governments of the European Union. So if you're a German company, the German government would be imposing penalties on you as a German company for not having, for having too much CO2 emissions in your supply chain, for doing business with companies that have too much CO2 emissions in their supply chain, etc. Right. If you're a Swedish company and you don't have enough minorities working on your board of directors or in your management or something, and that's part of their ESG system, then you can get fined. If you're doing business with an American company that doesn't have enough minorities on their board of directors, then you could theoretically get fined just for working with them. That's how this is going to work.
So is there any like specific numbers as to what the financial penalties would be? Like, if it's like $50, like, okay, whatever, we're just going to go along how we've been going along and not paying any attention to this ESG stuff. Or is it like a big penalty? Do you have any idea?
As far as I know, I'd have to look, I've read the resolution, but I would have to look at it again, but I don't think that they actually have a specific thing put into the resolution.
I actually don't even think it's the most important of questions. I was just more curious because even if it was the equivalent of a slap on the wrist, it just opens the door for that penalty to increase over time as more people get on board and as this thing becomes more publicly supported. Right. So that is a very interesting thing. You already went over how this, even though it's just in Europe, it still has major repercussions here in the United States. A good analogy to that would be like the laws regarding vehicles, regulations in vehicles in California, where if something, right, whether it's like cafe laws in California, because it's such a large market, it essentially is all the companies are going to cater to that because it's the most strict of the regulations. So if California just does it, doesn't matter. The entire United States is going to abide by that. Very similar is what's going on here, right?
Yeah, I think that's a great comparison. For those people who don't know, California, because it's such a major market, when they pass regulations or rules about various consumer products and goods, one of the main things is the automotive industry. It really impacts them a lot, and they say things like, for example, cars have to have XYZ fuel economy standards. Okay, in California, otherwise you can't sell them here. Then what happens is the automakers just adjust to those standards, and everybody in the whole country has to pay the higher price to get the car that is more fuel efficient because that's the law in California, and California is a major market. Well, that's true in this case as well. And the important thing to keep in mind is it's not, because you might be thinking, well, America has a gigantic economy. They have the biggest economy in the world. So wouldn't we be put first? But the thing to remember is that half the country here is okay with this. So half the country here is okay with it. Europe is mandating it. And because of that, the people who don't want it here are not, it's not 50-50. It's not, well, it's liberals versus conservatives, and it's about, 50-50 split in America. No, it's from the corporate perspective, it's all of Europe wants this, and that's the law over there. And half the country here wants it. So why do we care what these other people over here who talk about free markets and individual liberty, who cares about them? Why do I care if they get mad and they say they're not going to buy our products? If I have to choose between conservative Americans or all of Europe, I choose all of Europe. And that's how these big corporations are going to look at this. And it's an incredibly dangerous thing to do, but this is the product in a lot of ways of globalization, which is not necessarily globalization. There's a lot of benefits to it, but this is one of the dangers and one of the downsides to globalization is big, gigantic corporations are not really American corporations. They're corporations that cater to whatever is in the best interest of the corporation, even if that's not in the best interest of freedom of individual people. And in this case, they're looking at the writing on the wall and they're saying what's in the best interest of my corporation. It's appeasing the ruling class in Europe. It's making the central bank here in the United States happy. It's making sure that the Joe Biden administration is happy. That all comes in front of what consumers want because those people control a lot more money together than your run-of-the-mill conservative consumer does. So that's the direction this is all heading.
One more question. We've talked about obviously the Great Reset and how it would run its course in the United States, even in absence of a straight up law like this. I wasn't expecting a law like this in Europe. I don't think you were, at least in the short term. Here it is. So do you think that we'll see something similar in America, like an actual legislation enforcing something like this? Or go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that ideally, if the left had its druthers, it would have already done that. And I think that it's hard to pass this kind of law in the United States through an actual piece of legislation. But I do think that ideally they would have this and they would put this into place. There are ways that they can do this in effect using regulatory changes that don't necessarily require a new law. And one of those ways is through the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission. What they can do, because the SEC is responsible for regulating a whole bunch of different things, but one of the things they regulate is the stock market and publicly traded companies and requirements for publicly traded companies. And so one of the things the SEC can theoretically do, I don't know if this would be totally in keeping with federal law, but there are people already calling for this, is the SEC could say, in order to be listed in the New York Stock Exchange or in any American stock exchange of any kind, you have to disclose certain information. You have to have ESG scores in place. And we're requiring that in order to be a publicly traded company. So you don't necessarily have to be a publicly traded company, of course, but if you're already a publicly traded company, you're not going to suddenly stop becoming one just to avoid having to do these ESG scores. That's not going to happen. So what is going to happen is you're just going to put these ESG scores in place, and and a lot of these companies already have, as I said earlier, 80% of large businesses in the United States, according to one study, already have ESG scores in place. And it would be an easy regulatory change. And very recently, the SEC announced that they were going to start moving in the direction of potentially requiring, at the very least, ESG scores related to climate change issues for companies that are publicly traded. So if you're on a stock exchange, which is all the big corporations in America, and you or most of the big corporations in America, you want to be on the stock exchange, you have to start disclosing climate change information and that means, your energy usage, for example, whether you use electric cars versus gasoline powered cars, the amount of land that your businesses consume, the CO2 emissions in your supply chain, the air quality of your facilities, on and on and on. All of that has to start being disclosed as part of an ESG system. And there's some really interesting evidence that points to the idea that the head of the SEC and top people at the SEC support expanding this into other areas as well, and that they want to make this a regulatory requirement. Not that you necessarily have to do something. They're not saying you have to have an ESG score that is, above a certain threshold, but they are starting to put the groundwork into place that would require publicly traded companies to have ESG scores and to publicly share them, and for those ESG scores to be sort of standardized, and for the SEC to be overseeing those ESG scores and the reporting requirements. So that is starting to happen. It is becoming it is the first step towards making requiring people meet certain thresholds. But as we've talked about many times before, when we've talked about ESG scores, the funding aspect of all of this, the money printing, the financial institutions, the banks, all these people are already starting to impose ESG scores in effect on all of these big corporations anyway, by saying, we're not going to invest in your company if you don't have a high ESG score. We're not going to allow you to bank with us, if in the case of some large banks, if you don't have a good ESG score, on and on and on. So this is already happening. It's already being put into place through the financial institutions, through the banks, through the central banks. And the SEC is now just moving things a little bit further down the field. And as we move along in time, this is only going to continue expanding and getting bigger and harder to pull back. It's already reaching a point now where if the European Union actually puts this into place and makes this a requirement, and these countries actually enforce it, I don't know how it's going to be very, very hard to pull this back and get rid of this system and deconstruct it once it's already been built. It's going to be very, very difficult to do, and it's not going to happen under the Joe Biden administration because he supports it, and John Kerry supports it, and a lot of other big people in the Biden administration, we believe, are strong supporters of this. And so this is going to be very, very difficult at this point to roll back. It's not hopeless, but it is getting to a critical point where if we don't start pushing back on this soon, I don't know how we stop it in the long run.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, we consider this to be the most important thing going on right now. Justin, am I echoing to you?
Nope.
Okay, good. Yeah, it's the most important thing going on right now, so that's why we've been covering it so much. If you follow us, you know that we do a whole bunch of videos on this constantly. If you want to find more information on this, you can go to stoppingsocialism.com. You can find us on pretty much all of social media, Stopping Socialism on Facebook, Stopping Socialism TV here on YouTube. Make sure to subscribe, like this, share this. You can also find us on Instagram, Parler, pretty much everywhere nowadays. Justin, where can the fine people find you?
At Justin T. Haskins on Facebook and Socialist Twitter and Parler.
All right, thank you all for tuning in.